All right. Hi, everybody. We're going to get started with today's webinar. First off, thank you all for attending our webinar. My name is Daniel Pham. I am the Public Affairs Manager at the American Society for Biochemistry and Molecular Biology, or ASBMB. So today we'll be discussing our recent paper published in eLife, making the case for postdoc title consolidation. We have three great presenters for you. Dr. Michael Schaller, the chair of the Department of Biochemistry at the University of West Virginia and a member of the Public Affairs Advisory Committee for ASBMB, is the first author on the paper. Dr. Sarah Håkansson is the Director of Professional Development and Postdoctoral Affairs at Boston University. Dr. Aaron Heckler is the Postdoctoral Affairs Administrator at the Office of Graduate and Postdoctoral Affairs at the University of Chicago Biological Sciences Division. So Mike will give an overview of the paper. Sarah and Aaron will then discuss their efforts to consolidate postdoc titles at their institutions, and Mike will present our blueprint of the consolidation process. So we will end with a Q&A session. So if you have any questions during the webinar, you can type it into our Q&A box on the right side of the screen, and I'll present the question to our moderators. So I'll quickly give an introduction to ASBMB. So we were founded more than 100 years ago in 1906. We support more than 12,000 scientists and have maintained a public affairs department for more than 30 years since 1985. So we host a Hill Day, maintain a blog post called the Policy Blotter, and have recently began our grassroots advocacy network and also present public service awards. So we are governed by a public affairs advisory committee made up of 18 basic science researchers from around the U.S. Their focus, among many things, is to track legislation, engage federal agencies like the NIH, the NSF, and now the Department of Energy, and advocate for policies that have a positive impact on research. Our current chair is Matt Gentry from the University of Kentucky. So that being said, I'm going to turn the mic over now to Mike Schaller. Mike, take it away.
Okay, thanks. You guys hear me okay?
I think
Daniel,
so.
Are we good?
Yep,
okay.
We're good.
So I'm logged in under an alias here. So thanks to Joanna Mooney. That's the link that I could get in with. So I'm hiding a little bit here. So the next slide here, this is the abstract of our perspective that we just published in eLife. And the topic is the proliferation of names that are used to describe postdocs. And we believe that this is an issue for a number of reasons. It leads to inequities in pay, inequities in training. It leads to difficulties in trying to track postdocs through their careers. And we think that this is an issue, and the way to solve the issue is to standardize the names used for postdocs. Okay, so that's basically the problem. There's too many names for postdocs, and we need to standardize the postdocs. So here are some of the issues that we think lead to this problem. So if I ask you how many postdocs are in the United States, nobody could really give you a good answer. And the estimates have ranged from 30,000 to 80,000. In fact, Gary McDowell, one of our co-authors, and Chris Pickett recently published a piece that described the different numbers of postdocs from different institutions on a year-to-year basis, and the number of postdocs dramatically fluctuated year to year at a single institution even because of the way the postdocs were classified. So reclassifying the postdocs gave very different numbers. One of the problems is that postdocs are being trained, and the number of academic positions that are available for these postdocs to move into are much smaller than the number of postdocs that are completing their training. So the problem is that these highly trained scientists come through the postdoc, but then they stall in their career because there's not an academic position to slot into, and they need to find another position. So all of this is sort of related to the biomedical workforce, which we'll talk about in a minute. And one of the things we have to do is optimize our biomedical workforce. And if we can't identify who are postdocs, and we can't identify where they go, it becomes very difficult to track and to establish best practices for training of postdocs to prepare them for their career. The other problem that we feel these multiple designations for the same position causes is inequity of pay between postdocs. So for example, only about half of U.S. institutions follow the recommended minimum salary. And the other problem can be inequity in training between postdocs who are at the same position but have two different titles. So this perspective that we published is just a small piece of some efforts of the ASBMB PAC that we've been pursuing for a number of years. This sort of falls under the umbrella of trying to work towards a sustainable biomedical research enterprise. And this is a paper that Chris Pickett and other members of the PAC published a few years ago. Before this paper was published, there were a number of studies that identified a lot of problems that were impediments to sustaining the biomedical research enterprise. And the total number of recommendations that came out of these publications totaled over 200. So what Chris and colleagues did were they went through these pieces and distilled the common recommendations from all these different sources into 8 recommendations that the PAC thought that we should implement in order to sustain the biomedical research enterprise. 2 of these recommendations specifically related to postdocs. The first was that institutions and agencies should reduce the training period for students and postdocs. And the second recommendation was that students and postdocs should be trained for a breadth of careers that are available to them. After this paper was published, ASBMB and the PAC sponsored a summit meeting that had leaders from academia, from government, and people involved in education and training to come together to discuss these recommendations and figure out how we might implement changes. One small piece of this was the workforce, and a piece of that was the postdocs. Gary McDowell, who's one of the co-authors on the eLife paper, published a piece in ASBMB Today, and it's got 4 reasons why we don't need 37 names for a postdoc. And the illustration on the left are all the different names that postdocs are called, the titles that postdocs are given at different institutions. Gary and I followed up with another ASBMB piece talking about postdocs and are they still invisible and can we count them and can we track postdocs and how they're doing. The result of the problems, right, that come out of all these different names for postdocs, a single position with many names, are the following. First of all, there's an issue with data reporting. How do you report on the number of postdocs you have if you don't know what they're called, if they have many, many different names? And this sounds like a trivial bean counting thing, but I think this is really important in terms of thinking about optimizing the biomedical workforce, and it comes back to establishing best practices. If you can't track and follow practices and outcomes, how can you decide the best way to train the workforce? The second problem is alignment of salary and benefits. If you have different names, you can have different salaries, you can have different benefits. So people doing exactly the same work in exactly the same position with 2 different names are compensated differently. There's a problem also with training, right? People with in the same position with 2 different designations can have very diverse training and very diverse career development opportunities, and that puts some at a disadvantage relative to the others. It's difficult to track their time, and these were issues that came up with the changes or proposed changes in the FLSA regulations about a year ago. And again, salary designations, different folks are compensated differently for doing the same job because they've got a different name. So how are different institutions addressing this issue? Multiple postdocs, multiple designations for postdocs that are really doing the same type of job. And I'm going to hand the floor over to Aaron now to talk about how the University of Chicago addressed this issue, and then we'll hear from Sarah to talk about how Boston University is doing the same. Aaron?
Hi, can you hear me?
Good.
Can you hear me?
Yep, sounds good.
Okay. So I am in the Biological Sciences Division, and we actually went through and did this a while ago before my time. So I'm going to start with the rationale for why our division decided to do that. So what we wanted to do is we heard both from the Postdoc Association and our side as the office that we needed to create equity between the different types of postdocs. We don't want fellows to have certain advantages over scholars or vice versa. So the first thing that Dean Nancy Schwartz did was analyze all the different titles and establish two types of postdocs. So we have postdoctoral scholars, which are typically paid through their faculty member's R01 or another grant that their faculty member has. A postdoctoral fellow is typically on an NRSA, F32, T32. They can be paid direct from money from their home country, from fellowships from their country of origin, some other private fellowships. Depends how the funding agency wants the fellowship to be paid. So we also implemented a supplemental stipend at the same time, and that's calculated to include all the costs and benefits that a postdoctoral scholar receives. So in our division and our university, that includes health insurance, short and long-term disability, life insurance, and everything else listed there, as well as the calculated estimated taxes with that extra income to cover benefits, so that they're not having an extra tax burden as well. And that is mandatory for all postdocs in the Biological Sciences Division. Their faculty member pays that extra supplement through discretionary funds. At the same time, we also adopted the NIH NRSA stipend as the minimum compensation for postdocs, whether they're scholars or fellows. So if there's a difference in their fellowship amount, that to be brought up to the minimum also has to be compensated for. And both scholars and fellows have a mentoring plan requirement. So that is what we started with. So over time, it's changed a little bit, but the main advantages of this are creating equity and parity across postdoctoral experiences. We don't want to have different groups of postdocs having a different experience while they're at the university. It also makes it easier for postdocs who are going between appointment types, and some postdocs felt that there was a disincentive when they're applying for fellowships. If they're not going to have the same benefits and they're have to pay more for benefits, their effective salary would be less, so we wanted to avoid that. It also makes it easier for administrators when they're appointing postdocs. There's only two bins they can go into, and it's pretty straightforward that postdoc scholars and fellows what the differences are. It also, on our end, simplifies the data collection. Like Mike was mentioning, if you need to count people to start to collect data. And then we use that data for analysis and reporting, both for federal agency requirements, for grant requirements, but also for our own information. What's the makeup of our postdocs? What are they doing? How could we support them better? So our office provides information on grants and training and ethics for all postdocs. So that's another way to create parity. So postdoc fellows and RSA fellows are required to do ethics, but we offer that for all postdocs and specifically for postdocs. We collect and report that attendance for grants. In 2014, we implemented the annual evaluation and reappointment form that was based on something that was started at Washington University in St. Louis. And so that provides all postdocs, scholars, and fellows with formal feedback, covers all aspects of their career and professional development, so both skills and professional development. What are they doing outside of the lab? And so the postdoc and mentor work on this together. So that's another new thing that both types of postdocs complete. What we would recommend is that when you're doing this process, include all the other policy elements that you want to incorporate, salary minimums, term limits, training, mentoring, etc., so that you're standardizing the postdoc experience all at once for everyone. So that's basically from our side what we did.
All right, Sarah, I think you're up.
Great. Hi, everyone. I'm Sarah Hokinson. Can you all hear me okay?
I
Great.
think so.
You're good, Sarah.
Awesome. Well, I'm the Director of Professional Development and Postdoctoral Affairs here at Boston University, and I also co-chaired our Provost Task Force on the non-faculty academic research job family. And so, we undertook this last spring, so it was slightly ahead of the FLSA changes, but we had already begun to hear the buzz about FLSA when this task force was beginning to convene. But I would say that the primary motivator for this was around university data. Our academic research job family had 12 titles, and I began to ask the question, are they all necessary? And this was in part because of how members of this family were hired. So unlike other staff positions at Boston University, members of this family are hired at the departmental level. And that meant that every department took license as to how they defined all 12 of these titles. And so in terms of trying to count postdocs, my office was brand new, started in 2015. And what I found was that postdocs weren't just called the 3 postdoc titles, but in fact, we had some of them that were called all kinds of other things because that was how that specific department defined postdoc positions. And so I began to ask the question of, is this really all necessary? And one of the advantages of sitting in the office of the Vice Provost for Research in the Provost's office was that I was able to make an appeal that this was something that the university needed to get ahead of and prioritize, and that we shouldn't just look at postdocs in a vacuum, but rather look at the entire family as a whole. And so postdocs were but a part, and so I'll focus a little bit on how our task force tackled this problem and the types of things that we thought about. But I just wanted to make that part clear because I do think that looking at the whole family changed how we approached this particular situation. And so our goals, less was more. So we wanted to basically streamline it so that there were high-level job categories or specific job functions that then could be specifically defined either in subgroups or through other data information. So for example, the postdoctoral fellow, those receiving stipends, we can find that information through other data sources. So do we really need a separate title for them? And so we really wanted to create a sort of category, subcategory structure where less was more. And then we wanted to come up with a set of job descriptions. So basically ensuring that, in fact, everyone understands what a research scientist is or what a postdoc is. That will help PIs recruit the right individuals, advertise the right positions, but then also helps us distinguish between the categories. And we wanted to also start to create, as Erin talked about, equity between categories so that there were the same compensation and benefits. And this was really specific to the postdoc category because our postdoctoral fellows have a different benefit structure than our employee postdocs. And so we wanted to begin to think about minimum salary and stipend recommendations as well as vacation and sick time, which also differ between those categories. We talked also about performance management. So for postdocs, we had a recommended mentoring plan, but again, for the broader researchers, they weren't part of the formal performance management process and it wasn't really enforced. And so we wanted to think about how we could create a structure in which researchers actually get feedback. And then we wanted to think about the academic privileges associated with these positions. Should they teach? Should they have automatic PI status? Should either of those be limited, and what encapsulates professional development versus job responsibilities? So we wanted to talk a little bit about all of those things in terms of making recommendations. And so I guess I'll stop here and talk a little bit about our progress or our process. So we met 12 times. It was a committee of 12 people. It was half faculty and half staff. So the staff were really comprised of folks from HR, compensation, international scholars and students office, the provost's office, and then we had some grants administrators as well. And then on the faculty side, we tried to look at the distribution of postdocs, primarily because postdocs are the biggest subgroup of this family as a whole. They made up over 70% of the academic research job family. And so we looked at places with the highest concentration of postdocs, and we picked faculty from those departments and schools and colleges to be represented on the committee. And so you saw the flow chart in the eLife article. That was meant for departments. So that was meant to be a sort of simple, user-friendly way of helping departments make the decision about how to hire which candidates into the proper positions. But we did have a broader set of recommendations that I'll just talk about it before we kind of move into the next phase of the webinar. And so the first was that academic responsibilities and privileges outside of research are characteristic of faculty appointments rather than staff positions. So it's not to say that researchers, including postdocs, can't request PI status, for example, but that it's not automatic for these categories, that PI status in the absence of a fellowship for a larger scale grant needs to be on a request basis for all of these positions. The second recommendation was that we decided that there was a difference between research support versus research. So we did not think that the non-faculty academic research job family should be expanded to include positions like research administrators or those that actually support the research that's being done, but in fact should be focused on just those who are in research groups conducting research. And then finally, we made the decision that all of the positions within this job family should be compensated. So I probably shouldn't admit this in a public webinar, but there were cases where BU was allowing, for example, postdoc volunteers for those whose appointments had ended for whatever reason and they hadn't found a subsequent appointment. They were being flipped into a non-compensated position for them to have continued university access. And we decided that that was not the way that we wanted to conduct research at BU, and so we now have a compensated requirement for all of these positions, understanding, of course, that sometimes compensated means stipend or direct pay, but that we need evidence that they are receiving some sort of compensation for the research that they're doing. And then finally, just to help people get a sense of how we came up with that flowchart and how we made the choices that we did, our main recommendation within our report focused on distinguishing criteria. So what are the actual criteria that we were using to distinguish between different types of positions that contribute to research and research-related scholarship? And so we decided that, there were criteria that don't, we wanted to focus on what are the day-to-day responsibilities of these positions. So, what does a postdoc do or is responsible for versus that of a research scholar. And so we decided that there were some criteria that we didn't want to use to distinguish between categories. So compensation was one. We didn't want to distinguish between stipend and salary because we wanted, for example, in the postdoc category to set the expectation that all postdocs should be in mentored training positions, not just those on training grants. And so we didn't want to set a precedent to have two classes of postdocs. So we went a slightly different way. Eligibility for benefits, source of funding, visiting or visa status, and discipline, so engineer versus scientist. We didn't want these things to basically define a job description. And then the other thing, that we looked at was the things that we felt should define the responsibilities of the positions. And so these were, in some cases, degree requirements or qualification requirements, training component when it came to the postdocs, and then level of experience. And so these are things that affect how people actually do their job. And so we felt like those were appropriate criteria to use to define the position descriptions that we came up with in the grid. And so from there, I'll turn it back over, but I look forward to your questions.
Okay, so as part of the end of the eLife article, we describe what we think are the benefits to both the trainees and to the institution to standardizing postdoctoral titles. One of the things that we think that this can do is that if there's a postdoctoral title and then there's other titles, but the other titles are not for postdocs. They're for more senior staff people, etc., that there could be a clear transition, a clear progression in career. You're a postdoc for X amount of time. That's your training period. Now you're done your training. It's time to move into the next position. The next position has an appropriate increase in salary, an appropriate increase in benefits, and now you're still doing a very important research position and research in an advanced research position, but you're beyond your training period. This also makes it easier if everybody who's a postdoc has the same title. It makes it easier to make sure that everybody who's doing the same work is being compensated equivalently and that they have the same career developments, the same career development opportunities. It allows harmonization of salaries across national standards. We talked a little bit about simplifying, tracking, managing, fulfilling reporting requirements, establishing best practices for training. And one other thing that I think is a benefit here, it will benefit the institution by establishing this clear progression from postdoc to a more advanced career and having this career progression really laid out. It may allow institutions to recruit and retain the best scientists. So the last thing that we wanted to do as part of this article was to provide a blueprint for how institutions that wish to consolidate names could go about doing this. And for this, we're indebted to both Aaron and Sarah for providing us their information on how they did it at their institutions, and also answering all of our questions as we went along to develop the ideas. So here's our thoughts of consolidation. The first thing to do is assess what are your different researchers, what are they doing, what are their daily responsibilities, what are their global elements that they're involved in. And if they're really a postdoc within a certain time frame of completing their terminal degree and they're in a training position, then they're a postdoc. And if they're doing other things beyond that, then they're not a postdoc. We would recommend position consolidation, either put these positions into a single position, or in some cases, like at University of Chicago, they very effectively did it in 2 positions. If you incorporate and consolidate into 2 positions, it's important to do what Chicago did, and that is ensure equal benefits between the 2 positions, equal compensation, equal training opportunity. The next step is to implement, and this is going to require policy changes at the institution. It's going to require standardization of salaries amongst postdocs, establishing a minimum salary, defining what renewal restrictions are, how long is your training period, and then it's going to be important to disseminate and advertise the policy. And then it's going to be important to monitor to make sure that everybody is following the policy. And that's the end sort of the sketch of the eLife article, and I'll hand it back over to Daniel, and we'll address any questions that you guys have.
Thank you all so much for your presentations. So if you have any other questions for our speakers, please write them in the window to your right. So we're going to start with the first question for either of you. So Ed had a question of how do you define and measure experience level?
I can jump in to expand what I wrote in the chat. So at BU, we considered the degree as well as years conducting research to denote how we marked experience. In terms of tracking, what I can say that on the postdoc side, for our postdoc appointments, we require the submission of a CV, and that's something that I review as part of the appointment process. And so I can look at their years of experience based on that review. And so I can tell basically, oh, this person has a PhD and they've been a postdoc for 7 years already. Should they really be appointed as a postdoc, or would a staff scientist type role, in our case research scholar, make more sense? And so And so I'll stop there in case Aaron wants to chime in, and then we can take other questions.
Hi. Yeah, we also take CVs as part of the appointment process, but also as part of the reappointment process. So we get an updated CV every year. And Ed was asking if we incorporate the number of publications. So I just recently started collecting the number of publications that a postdoc enters with, and then the number that they leave with. But it's really only because the training grants started requiring that information, and I didn't have it yet.
And I can say on publications, that's something that we're exploring here right now. BU has access to a new tool called it's called My CV at BU, but I think that's a BU name for a broader sort of data management software around CV information and profile. It's kind of like a portfolio, and so that's one tool that we have, as well as the BU Profiles tool, to be able to track postdoc publications.
Great. So this is a question probably for Mike. Tim Harrigan asked if you can elaborate on the distinction between the two recommended titles, either a postdoc scholar versus a research scholar.
Okay, the two titles, the postdoc scholar and the research scholar, are from University of Chicago, right, Aaron? So the one of them is a university position and considered an employee of the university, and the source of funding for that individual comes from the university or a grant to the university, etc. And the other one is a position where the postdoc is supported by extramural dollars directly. So on their own fellowship, their own F-32, for example, or their own fellowship from another institution. And Aaron may weigh in on this, but the rules and regulations at Chicago didn't let them put these two categories together. And there were different rules and regulations for each, and the ones that were supported extramurally had a training component that was dictated by the supporting agency, and the position that was a university position did not have a training component. The university position had benefits. Folks that were supported extramurally did not have benefits. So what Chicago did was decided to manage those two identically and establish policies that made sure that both were compensated the same, both titles had the same benefits, and both titles had the same career development or training opportunity.
If I could jump in, you're actually talking about Boston's titles. So what you've described is Aaron's postdoc model, where there are two different postdoc titles. But in this case, they're referring to the BU research scholar, which is our staff scientist position, versus a postdoc, I think. Is that correct in terms of the question? Or at least that's how I read the question.
Okay. To go that way, so there are two different postdoc titles, right, at Chicago, and the other model at Boston is to use the postdoc as one title and then a distinct title, research scholar, as the next position up. So the postdoc is the training position that's compensated at one level and has the career development opportunity. The research scholar at the next position is really like a staff scientist, so there's no training component there. There's increased compensation, and there's increased benefits.
Yeah, it's actually the same benefits.
All right, we're going to move on to the next question.
Sorry, I just want to clarify, it's the same benefits.
Did you have anything
and as well, you can go straight from a PhD into that research scholar position. So you don't have to stop at postdoc, although you can also go from a postdoc into the research scholar position. What the difference is really, again, around the job functions and the career development as you described, but I just want to make it clear that it's not entirely linear in the sense that we have many people who are in research scholar positions in our core facilities, for example, where they're directly out of their PhD, but their job function is not as a postdoc. It is to manage the instrumentation as part of that core. And so redefining them as a research scholar is more appropriate in that case. So I just wanted to provide that clarification.
All right, thanks, Aaron. Where's that, Sarah? So one question for both Aaron or Sarah from Bob Matthews. Once you implemented these at your universities, was there any pushback from faculty or postdocs? And if so, how was it handled?
I'm sure there was some initial pushback from faculty when we instituted the supplemental stipend, but we worked with the dean's office first to make sure that they understood that it was mandatory, but also to point out, the postdoc is bringing in most of the money for their salary. This small amount that you're paying is so that they can have equal benefits and have a good quality of life. So once the faculty understood the purpose of the supplement, we don't really have any problems, and we just recently increased it, and I didn't really get any pushback from that.
And here at BU, we're still in the process of implementing it, but what I would say is that we got far more pushback on the postdoc term limit that we put into place in 2016 than we did on consolidating the titles. So postdocs were much more concerned about the notion that they wouldn't be called postdocs anymore than anyone was about eliminating titles. Most people found our job family to be cumbersome and confusing, and so overall the feedback was pretty positive, and most people liked the idea that there was a real progression, that it was possible to create a staff promotion track in a way that was a little less clear under the former model.
How did you deal with the concern if with the term limit and postdocs wanting more time to find faculty positions? Was that an issue? Is that part of why people were concerned of implementing
Absolutely,
that
yes.
limit?
That was the main point of feedback. That, and in some cases they felt in their K award applications, particularly for K01s, that they would be less competitive as a research scholar or a research scientist than they would as a postdoc. And so I would say that we have dealt with this for the most part on a case-by-case basis. In certain places, there are junior-level non-tenured faculty positions that we can help those postdocs transition to that are more appropriate for their years of experience and the types of grants that they're applying for. In other cases, I think it's working with them to on the career development side. So we haven't shied away from implementing the term limit, but I think our response to the concern is tailored to the individual that's approaching to us.
Yeah, I would say we have a similar
Thank you.
response. We allow extensions for postdocs, but we need to work with their faculty needs to submit like a reasonable explanation for why they would need an extension. It has to be in the interest of the postdoc's career. So if they have a fellowship, they would most likely get an extension on their term limits for that reason.
All right. So there's another question from Donna. Will these consolidations in postdoc change were there any implications for what advice you would give to researchers that are searching for a postdoc position, and how would this affect advocating for their needs, such as benefits and performance evaluation?
I think
for the first.
Sorry, this is
ahead,
Erin.
Sarah.
I think that it's really important that the institutional
Go ahead,
support is there. A lot of the postdoc experience comes down to what the institution thinks about postdocs, how they support them. So I always encourage postdocs or grad students looking for a postdoc, is there a postdoc office? What are the benefits? And asking those questions when they actually go on the interview to clarify the importance and make sure that that's an expectation from the beginning before they even take the position.
Yeah, and I recently contributed to a book on the postdoc landscape where we outlined an interview checklist for postdocs positions, and part of that checklist was developed in consultation with this task force. And so if that's a resource that people are interested in, I'm happy to share it with the group post-workshop.
I think in terms of implications of what advice you give to people looking for a postdoc, the advice still would be look for the best training opportunity. in the area that you're interested in, both the lab and other training opportunities available. And Aaron pointed out the importance of a strong postdoctoral association that will advocate their needs at that institution.
All right, great. So to Mike, so although the University of West Virginia is an institution with a smaller postdoc population, how would you think this postdoc title consolidation would affect schools such as yours?
Well, the one thing it would help us with track the number of postdocs. So we have trouble figuring out how many postdocs we have at the institution because we use so many different titles. I think it would help in preparing grants from trainees with a number of different titles. You know, I've had to write in letters of support for applications, argue whether a position is a postdoc position or not, in order to make it eligible for funding or not. Somebody who's really a postdoc but who has a different title will have to make the case that this really is a postdoc and they should be funded. So our institution really is more student-driven than postdoc-driven, but I think there are a few cases there where if we had a streamlined and sort of rigorous assignment of trainees to postdoc positions and non-trainees to staff positions, it would solve a few problems and make things a little bit smoother here.
Sounds good. So there's a question for, I think, Aaron. After the implementation of your recommendations, what were some maybe unforeseen benefits or consequences?
I think one of the things that people don't think about is making it easy for your administrators. So the main difference in the two types of postdocs is really about how benefits are paid, and that's a very logistical concern for administrators, and it makes their lives a little bit easier to know exactly what to do in what situation. And also postdocs are often switching between scholar and fellow. You know, they're getting a fellowship, the fellowship ends, they go back to being a scholar. It makes that process a lot more simple when the only real thing that changes is how their benefits are paid.
Great. So to Mike, do you think an recommendation similar to this could affect or could be good for staff scientists? Because there are also a very wide range of titles for those who are not in a postdoc or a grad student categories. So do you think something like that could also be beneficial?
Yeah, I think. Do you mean consolidating the title of staff scientist, or consolidating to this flow like at Boston University?
Consolidating either or both.
Well, I think what BU really did that, right, is they took all of these research positions and put them into several different categories. So they ended up consolidating other research positions consolidating titles of other research positions, not just postdocs. And I think that really would help the staff scientist situation because the natural progression then, right, would be from the postdoctoral training period, and you have X amount of time in your training period with all the career development opportunities, et cetera. And then when you complete that, it's time to move on. And if you move into the staff position, and we argue in the perspective piece that moving to that staff position should have an increase in salary, but also an increase in benefits, and that this would then define what that position is, and make a more clear demarcation between the postdoctoral position and the staff scientist position.
All right, great. Does anybody else have any other questions? Please type in your questions for our speakers if you do. If not, I have one last question for either of you. Would this change have affected your careers in any way if this had occurred while you were doing your scientific training?
Unfortunately, I would say no. I was called a postdoc. And I was in my postdoc for about 4.5 years, and then was fortunate to find a faculty position.
The requirement for career and professional development would have been very helpful, and to make sure that everyone is, as a postdoc, we didn't have career and professional development at where I was at Rutgers. We kind of created our own. So being somewhere where that's important and part of the requirement, and your faculty member, all faculty members are aware of it and supportive, that would have been really, really helpful.
I'm afraid this is probably an institutional benefit policy. I mean, I think there are some benefits to those within the structure, but it would, I was a F-32 postdoc fellow at Cornell, and I'm not sure any of the other academic positions at Cornell would have ever applied to me. So I'm not sure that it would have helped me specifically, but I hope it's helpful to our community here.
All right, so last question from Imogen. Is there any discussion nationally of consolidating postdoc titles across institutions? Do you think a recommendation that ASBMB has would be palatable for everybody, or will there be kind of some differences between universities according to their needs?
Well, it's interesting. Our task force discussed this. One of the risks that we saw was that if we came out with Postdoc Scholar and then, in a year's time, this became a national issue and everyone decided upon a different postdoc title, that we would have to go back through and kind of change all of our data and titles all over again to conform with whatever the national recommendation was. And I think our thinking was that we just decided that this was something that BU really needed to do in order to get the kind of infrastructure that we wanted, and that if one particular category needed to be adjusted at a later time, it probably wouldn't affect the rest of the job family, and it would be a sort of easy justification for the switch. And so we decided to proceed anyway. But that was certainly something that we thought about when we were thinking about this.
Any thoughts from Aaron or Mike? All right. So with any further ado, do either of you have any closing remarks you would like to make before we end the webinar?
I guess I would just say that we put some time into thinking about this problem as a way to sustain the biomedical research enterprise, and that we really think that Sarah at BU and Aaron at Chicago have really identified the solution to this problem, and that by transitioning to standardized postdoc titles, that we could really improve the workforce, not in the short term, but over the long term.
Great. All right. Well, if there's nothing else, first we'd like to give huge thanks to our presenters, Sarah, Aaron, and Mike, taking their time to discuss this very vital issue in our community. And thank you all for attending. I know some of you had some audio problems, but the video of this webinar will shortly be available. You can keep an eye out on our Policy Blotter website, policy.asbmb.org. If you have any further questions for any of our speakers, you're welcome to email us. The email is on the webinar page, publicaffairs@asbmb.org. And if that's it, thank you so much for attending.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you all.